In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to make these simple and beautiful fabric coasters. The final measurements of these ones are 4.5 by 4.5 inches. The special thing about these coasters is I made these out of the fabric scraps I got from my previous project. I hope you remember I asked you to keep those fabric scraps ready for another project, and this is it. I was able to make two coasters out of one project since I used a different fabric layer for the back of the coaster. You can also use the patchwork style for both front and back if you prefer things that way. Now, if you ever made a box tote bag or a fabric basket, you know that you'll need to cut out 4 small square-shaped fabric pieces out of the 4 corners. When you're working with both outside and lining fabric layers, you'll eventually cut out 8 square-shaped fabric pieces. Now those are the fabric scraps I'm going to use for the front of my coasters. Each of these squares measures 3 by 3 inches in size, and those measurements may change according to the project you worked with. I think 3 by 3 inches size squares will work great for making coasters. As for the materials, for the front of the coaster, we are going to need 4 3 by 3 inches squares, and this is how I'm going to place mine. Similar fabrics facing each other in a diagonal way. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm going to leave the remaining 4 scraps to make a second coaster. If you don't have pre-cut scraps like these, you can now start cutting those out and join with me for this project. Next, we need an interface as the middle layer, and for this scenario, cut yours about 6 by 6 inches in size. As you can understand, we are eventually gonna end up needing less than that. If you can't find any interface, you can also use any thicker layer of natural fabric as a substitute. Then for the back of the coaster, cut a piece of fabric measuring about 6 by 6 inches in size. Even here, it's an approximate size, and you'll eventually gonna trim it off depending on the size of the front layer. All of these are cotton fabric, and other than that, you'll also need your regular supplies like pins or clips, a pair of scissors, a ruler, a fabric marking pen, your sewing machine with a coordinating thread color, and having a rotary cutter may come in handy if you have one. Now let's start with assembling the pieces for the front. Decide how the pieces place, and here we only have 2 rows to work with. So for the first row, place the 2 pieces facing the right sides together, and next we are going to sew along that connecting margin. It'll be same for the second row as well. Place the right sides together and sew along the connecting margin. Make sure the 2 margins are properly aligned before you start sewing. Then sew along, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Trim the thread once you reach the other end and move on to the next one. I don't know if you noticed this, but some of these fabric scraps have fusible fleece attached, and I want you to know it's from my previous project. I didn't bother removing them. After you are done with both rows, unfold the pieces and let me show you how it looks. Now before moving on to the next step, we need to spread the seams apart on the wrong side of the fabric. You can hand press it, but I'm gonna iron it over to keep things nice and flat. These small steps count when you want to level up your sewing projects. After pressing the seams apart, now turn over to the right sides facing up and place the pieces the way you want in the final piece. Then place the 2 pieces facing the right sides together, aligning on their connecting margin. Use a couple of pins or clips to keep the 2 layers in place, and then we can sew along this connecting margin to make a single layer for the front of the coaster. Start at one of the ends and sew straight, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Remove the pins as you go and make sure the seams are staying spread apart while going over it. That will help you to get an evenly thickened fabric layer. With that done, we have a single layer of beautiful patchwork as the front layer. Again, turn over to the back of the fabric and press the seams apart by ironing it over. To be honest, I was lazy to do these things like ironing and using a lot of pins when I first started. But with time, I understood it's not a waste of time. Actually, these are the things that help you to move forward smoothly. Moving on to the next step, now it's time to attach the interface. Place the wrong side of the fabric on top of the interface and you can then choose any style to sew it to the interface. I'm thinking of more of a simple style, and for that, using a ruler and a fabric marking pen, first I'm going to draw 2 diagonal lines on the fabric like this. Mine is a heat erasable fabric marking pen and I can easily get rid of these markings later by simply ironing it over. Make sure lines are visible enough for you and draw lines in any way you prefer. You can even do free quilting as well. After that, we are going to top stitch along these lines. But before doing that, we need to keep the 2 layers together while sewing. For that, use a few pins to attach the 2 layers together and keep the pins out of the way of those drawn lines. Now let's start top stitching straight along the lines, one line at a time. Making coasters is one of the simple and beginner-friendly projects you can do. So if you are thinking of making your own gifts for this holiday season for the first time, I think making coasters is a good place to start. To add a bit of spice to that, you can come up with the patchwork quilted coasters like this one. After top stitching along both lines, you can now start trimming the entire thing to make it into a perfect square shape. Since this is a small area, you can even use your fabric cutting scissors for this step. If you have a ruler and a rotary cutter, things will be much easier for you. You can simply place the ruler straight and run the cutter along that line. But don't worry if you don't have one, it's not a must. If you only have your pair of scissors, first draw straight lines to make it into a perfect square shape and then cut along those lines using your scissors. Both ways work and use whatever you already have in hand to complete the project. Now this is how the front layer looks after the trimming. The next step is to prepare the back layer of the coaster to match with the size of the front layer. As you can remember, we cut a piece of fabric for the back layer, measuring about 6 by 6 inches. All the patchworking and trimming of the front layer made its final measurements about 5.5 by 5.5 inches. So to match with the front layer, we need to trim down the back layer. For that, place the 2 fabric layers facing right sides together and then place a weight to keep the 2 layers steady. Now using your fabric cutting scissors, trim down the back layer to match with the size of the front layer. As you can see, I have already placed the right sides of both layers facing each other, and now we can move on to the next step. Make sure both layers are aligned and you can then use a few pins to keep the 2 layers together. Next, from one of the sides, mark 2 points to leave about 2 inches space for turning the right side out at the end. Starting from one of the marked points, we are going to sew all the way around until we reach the other marked point. For this step, I'm leaving a half an inch seam allowance. Do a little back stitch at the beginning to securely start the sewing and simply sew straight. Whenever you reach a corner, stop the sewing and raise the foot while the needle is down. Then pivot and lower the foot. You can start sewing straight again. As I mentioned in the introduction, I got these fabric scraps from my previous project, which is a hamper type fabric gift basket. So if you are interested in checking that out, I'll leave the link in the description. You still have plenty of time for the holidays and I hope you'll give it a try. You can even add these coasters as a gift for your gift hamper as well. Once you reach the other marked point, do a little back stitch to securely end the sewing. Finally, trim all threads. Now it's time to turn the right side out using the space we left. But before doing that, we need to trim off the 4 corners to reduce the bulky parts. Otherwise, you won't get nice corners and things will get much more difficult when it comes to top stitching later. So make sure you won't skip this step. After that, using the small opening we left, carefully turn the right side out. Try not to damage or loosen the stitches while you are doing so. Poke things out as much as you can and then use a small rod like this one to poke out the narrow corners and sides. Even here, make sure not to damage or poke holes in the fabric while you are doing that. At this point, we are one step away from completing the project and now give everything a good press to keep things nice and flat and also to get rid of those lines we drew using the fabric marking pen. When you are pressing, make sure to press the seams at the opening area towards the inside as well. It will make things easier for our next step. Finally, we are going to top stitch all the way around, enclosing the opening we left. Start at any point and leave a 1/4 inch or less seam allowance. That will make sure the opening is properly enclosed. Don't forget to do a little back stitch at the beginning and sew straight. When you reach a corner, follow the same steps I mentioned earlier. Like I mentioned in my previous videos, I only have a basic sewing machine and when it comes to sew several fabric layers, things sometimes get a little tricky. So when doing a corner after I pivot, I try to give a bit of pressure onto the front area of the footer to stop things jamming, and that simple trick works just fine. I also got to know if you are using a seam jumper, it will help the footer to go smoothly over thicker fabric layers. It was a suggestion from one of you and I'm sorry I still didn't get a chance to buy one. When you reach the starting point, do a little back stitch to securely end the sewing, and with that final step, you have a simple coaster with a beautiful patchwork quilted design. Give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you like this beginner-friendly sewing project. And as always, thank you all for watching and I'll join you in the next one.